What happens when one man tries to watch all of the horror films of the 1980s? Well, we're about to find out because I'm your host, Josh Spiegel, and this is the 80s Project. So we're just plowing through 1983 now, and there's only a couple of episodes left, and the past couple have been lacking in big releases. And to be honest, we're a little more low-key than previously. So let's strap in and see if they can turn this one around and spice this year up a bit. This block begins on September 16th, although it did have a premiere earlier on in January, but went wide here, and it's Sweet 16. It begins with a dream sequence, and then we're at this little dive bar, and there's some racist hillbillies that get into a fight with Michael Myers, which is probably not the best idea. And yeah, this is Don Shanks, and he was Michael in Halloween 5. We also meet some local teens, and new girl in town Melissa goes home with Johnny, and her dad is pretty mad, and he's also an Avenger. After he drops her off, Johnny's killed by an unseen attacker, and then the movie makes this really weird choice of going out of its way to tell you that Melissa is only 15 years old, almost 16, and then having her have a full frontal shower scene. Johnny's friend Hank has a sister who we last saw go toe-to-toe with Jason, and a dad who's a bit wild, even without his bunch. When they find Johnny dead, Melissa lies about Jason, so they go to talk to him. Meanwhile, Melissa tries to integrate into her new school, and the killings seem to continue, with it seeming like the local elderly native is responsible, although shortly after, he's found hanged. Red herrings abound, with everyone looking towards Jason as being the most likely candidate, but it all comes to a head at Melissa's Sweet 16 birthday party. And this is a little lost slasher flick, or at least slasher adjacent, and was directed by Jim Sotos, and would end up being his most notable work, and his last horror one, since he did some comedy flicks after this. Originally, Leslie Nielsen was slated to play the role of Melissa's dad, but he had to drop out due to scheduling issues, and McNee stepped in. It's got some weird quirks, like the fact that it sort of feels like a TV movie, except for the nude scenes, which again, are all Melissa, a girl said to be 15 years old, although Elisa Shirley, the actress playing her, was 19 at the time. The other weird bit is that opening dream sequence, which has absolutely no bearing on the rest of the film, like, at all. It did get a theatrical run, although it didn't really make a splash, and the reviews weren't really kind, but it's since developed a small cult following, and even had a director's cut released on DVD. And it's decent, but not great, so I'll go with a 2.5 out of 5. It has some nice characters and is paced well, but it also feels like a touch directionless, and feels like things that you've seen before. Its horror cultural significance is a 2 since it's become pretty obscure, but it does have a small following and earned a bit of attention. Should you watch it? It's probably worth a peek. We're now headed all the way over to Hong Kong for this next one, which was released there on September 28th, and it's brutal Sorcery. It begins with a funeral for a man whose family requested he be buried on consecrated ground, and we flash back to his story. He was a taxi driver who finds out that his birthday means that he has a death curse because he was born on September 9th at 9 p.m., and that's 3 9s. And he's turning 27, and that's also 3 9s, and that sounds like super scientific, so it all has to be real. Later, he picks up a couple of passengers who turn out to be ghosts, which causes him to vomit up a whole bunch of spaghetti. And soon enough, he appears to be possessed by some sort of evil spirit. His family tries to exorcise whatever it is, and it's revealed to be the couple that he gave the ride to, and they're asking for him to find their bodies, dig them up, and take them back to their home in Thailand. He goes to see the woman's sister, and he just like brings her a duffel bag of their skulls. Like, oh, hi, nice to meet you. Here's some corpses. I guess that's a turn on for her, though, since they have a fling right after. But he is then forced to admit that he's married with a kid. Well, she's a bit bitter about that, and he returns home. So she places yet another curse on the dude. And I'm sure this movie's all like, well, he was just cursed because that whole birthday thing couldn't be avoided. But you know what? It could have. All he had to do was, I don't know, not cheat on his wife. He starts acting funny, like eating all their goldfish and then eating meat straight out of the fridge, and then I guess a live chicken. It's all just eating stuff, so not really the most brutal of sorcery. His family figure it out and once again team up to try to break it with the help of another magician. And this one is the directorial debut of Ling Pang, who would only make 3 films, and this was the only one that really had any impact. There's not really a ton of information out there about it, and was also one of the harder films to find a copy of to view, as it's not really had much of an official US release. I will point out that the ending of this one goes directly into Bizarre World, and also straight up lifts the Flash Gordon soundtrack for the music, which automatically makes it slightly more awesome. And I said slightly because I'm just giving this a 2. It's fun at times, but there's just too many long stretches of dull in between. Its significance is a 1, since it's barely even known amongst the Hong Kong horror crowd and takes concepts from existing films as opposed to breaking any new grounds. Should you watch it? You can probably pass. This sorcery is far less brutal than advertised.
You're also scared of ghosts.
Now we go back to the US and looking at a film that premiered sometime in October, going straight to video, and it's the Devonsville Terror. It starts back in the 1600s in Devonsville, a town in Massachusetts, and a couple of women are accused of witchcraft. They strap one to a torture wheel, which I'm sure is pretty awful and painful, but I'm not gonna lie, it also looks a little fun. Another one is tied to a stake and burned, and it seems like they were right about her since she curses the town. 300 years later, in the same town, one of the Bobs is here, and they refer to the incident as the Devonsville Inquisition. Looks like Walter kills his wife, though, and shortly after, there's a new arrival in town, and it's Susanna Love, and we've seen her twice this year already with Olivia and Boogeyman 2. She's the new school teacher, but there's also a town doctor, Doc Loomis, or I guess he's Dr. Worley here. Jenny settles in and meets Matthew, played by Robert Walker Jr., who was also with Love in Olivia. Meanwhile, Worley is the ancestor of the guy who did those executions all that time ago, and is cursed with worms that come out of his skin, which kinda sucks. He's trying to break that curse by finding out more about the Inquisition through hypnosis. Turns out there's a couple of other new ladies in town too, with a young environmentalist researching the water in town and a local radio DJ. But then it turns out that Jenny is more than she seems, getting revenge for Walter's wife. And it seems like the legend and curse is true. And this is yet another film from Uli Lommel, who is having a bit of a big year. Like I mentioned with Love, he also directed Olivia and The Boogeyman 2, all in '83, and all with the actress, who he was married to at the time. It was clearly a riff on the Salem witch trials, and it was filmed in Wisconsin, at the same locations that the Demons of Ludlow used. It had some issues though, since it was made for a theatrical release and a marketing company promoted it as such, but it only ever had one showing in New York City. Although it didn't really make a splash at the time, considering it was involved in a lawsuit that claimed it was very profitable, and the production company had to state on record that the film didn't make any profit at all. Since release, it's actually earned some acclaim for political commentary and message. And I tell you what, I'm not really much of a Lommel fan, but this is pretty damn solid, so I'm going to give this one a 3.5. It has some pacing issues, but I like the characters, and the storyline is interesting. Its HCS is a 1.5 though, since it's not really much known and didn't make a splash at the time, but it gets an extra 0.5 for Lommel and love and its modern reassessment. Should you watch it? Yes, embrace this terror. We're now going into this episode's highest profile flick, and it debuted on October 21st, right before Halloween, in both Canada and the US, and it's The Dead Zone. It has the Archangel Gabriel as a schoolteacher with an awkward haircut.
I want you to read The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. You're gonna like it. It's about a schoolteacher who gets chased by a headless demon.
I don't know. Maybe I'll wait until someone makes a movie out of it, as long as someone cool plays the horseman. He's in a relationship with Sarah, and one night after dropping her off at home, he gets into a horrible accident and goes into a coma. 5 years later, he wakes up and his doctor is Inspector Dreyfus, and he finds out that Sarah has since married another man. Johnny soon discovers that when he touches people, he gets psychic flashes and is able to help save a little girl from a burning house. He reunites with Sarah, and word of his abilities become public, so Captain Dallas reaches out to him for help tracking down a serial killer. But then, to add more to Johnny's to-do list, besides the love issues and the hunt for a killer, he also finds out about a political candidate that wants to be senator, and it's someone that will eventually be president, but not for another 15 years or so, under the assumed name of Bartlett. This dude is pretty evil and even intimidates Barry Convex, and Johnny predicts that he'll start World War III and has to do something because he knows that even if it's obvious that someone is a clear and present danger, people will still ignore it. And yep, this is another Stephen King adaptation, our second of the year after covering Cujo a little earlier. It's based on his novel from 1979 that had that same name and was headed up by none other than David Cronenberg, his first film after doing Videodrome. It had been in gestation for a few years, and there were a few passes at the script, with one of them by King himself. That one was rejected for being involved, convoluted, and as Cronenberg called it, needlessly brutal, and said it was the worst by far of the 5 scripts that he was sent for consideration. There were a lot of revisions to the original concept of the novel, including a complete restructuring of the way that it's told, and King would later tell Cronenberg that the alterations made the story much better in the long run. One of the early considerations to play Johnny was Bill Murray, as he was who King wanted to see in the part, but that didn't happen. The budget was around $10 million and got a soft distribution, one that the director was very disappointed in. Even with the limited theaters, the positive reviews boosted the recognition of the film, and it was a modest moneymaker with around $21 million in box office tickets. Later on, the novel would get a new adaptation and a TV series that starred Anthony Michael Hall as Johnny, and it ran for several seasons. Although it would use elements from the book and the movie, it was more episodic in nature. And I enjoy this quite a bit, so it's a 3.5. It's not my favorite Cronenberg, nor my favorite King, but it's got a good mood and really nice performances. I guess my biggest complaint with it is that the story feels a bit fractured and more like 3 episodes of a show as opposed to a movie, but that's a minor quibble. Its HCS is a 4 since it's very well known, has major names involved from the horror world as well as minor ones, is a King work, and spawned a TV series. Should you watch it? Yes! Enter this zone today. This next one has 2 listed dates for release, with one showing as July 14th and the other saying October 28th, and it appears as if the latter is the more accurate, and it's The Final Terror. It begins in the woods as a motorbiking couple are attacked and killed using tops of cans, and I can attest to those suckers' sharpness. But then we've got a bunch of guys, including Joey Pants and the Zemed, and why would I call him anything other than his name? Perfect Tommy is here too, but it's not quite as perfect of a look for him, and everyone is headed out on a big camping trip. The ladies include a thorn bird and a mermaid, and everyone clashes with the crabby Egger. They get out into the woods and start their excursion, and at night they tell campfire stories, and one is about a young woman who was raped and went crazy, giving birth in the institution. Her child was taken away, but 19 years later, he returned to see her and took her out to live with him in the forest. Their partying seems to wake somebody up out there, and the next day, strange things start to occur when a couple of them are missing. But then a killer shows up and starts the stabbing. Whatever it is has a Jason shack, and the crew soon figure out that they're being hunted. But with Edgar gone, they have no way back. But luckily, they're geared up for survival, and now have to match wits with whoever is in the forest waiting for them, although there's more secrets on hand here. And this is one that has a higher pedigree than you'd expect. It was an early film by Andrew Davis, and not long after this, he'd dive deep into the action world and do some Steven Seagal hits with Above the Law and Under Siege before doing the Fugitive movie and Collateral Damage with Arnie. It was actually shot back in '81 to capitalize on the success of both Halloween and Friday the 13th, and you can see a whole lot of the latter film on display here. However, it then had a bunch of trouble finding a distributor and sat on a shelf. Then, 2 years later, after Zemed and Hannah had a couple of successes, their name had star power, and the film finally found someone to release it. But they had to spice it up and add the death scenes in the intro without Davis's involvement. The reviews were middling, with people comparing it to Deliverance and Friday the 13th, and even though they really weren't all that negative, they weren't exactly favorable either. And yeah, it's okay, I give it a 2.5. It just feels like something we've seen several times already and done better, but it's still engaging enough and entertaining for its runtime. Its significance is just a 2, since it's not all that well known and is more discussed as a ripoff than an influential film, but it gets the extra point for the sheer amount of known faces in it. Should you watch it? Probably. I mean, it's not terrible. Here's one that didn't get a US release until 1984, but it was released in Canada on October 28th and then in Sweden on November 4th, and it's Spasms. There's this tribal ceremony in Micronesia, and this hunter guy is observing and sees some sort of giant force attack everyone, but they capture it in a net. Proximo is on hand, and he wants whatever is in that net, and his wife is Carrie Keene, who we saw recently in The Incubus. There's an Easy Rider here again, and we just saw him in the last episode with Dance of the Dwarfs, and Brazilian is enlisted by Kincaid for assistance. Seems that he was bitten by a snake on some sort of expedition, the same snake that killed his brother, and ever since he's developed some sort of psychic link to the thing, and has visions of its attacks. The big fella is being transported, but it looks like some sort of snake cult is also interested in it. It's headed up by the gold leader, and he's hired a private eye to help him to get his hands on it. Meanwhile, when a man tries to sneak a peek at it, he's bitten, and it causes his body to dramatically swell up and kill him. But when they deliver the snake to Brazilian's facility, they try to steal it and it breaks loose, setting everyone off in search of it. And this little number is from William Fruitt, and this is the third time that he's been featured on the project. We covered him before with 1980's Funeral Home, and again in 82's Baker County, USA. This was based on a book from 1979 called Death Bite that was a Jaws knockoff, and much like The Final Terror, it was shot in 1981. However, right before shooting, they experienced a number of issues. They planned to use a real snake in the movie and set up the acquisition of a 14-foot python, but then they never shot with it. There was also trouble wrangling up funding, causing several directors to sign on and then leave when production didn't begin. But then there were issues with the effects. Originally, the ending had the inclusion of a giant animatronic snake, but had trouble shooting with it, and never finished a sequence. Fruitt basically hated every scene that featured the big thing and decided to show it as little as possible, requiring several sequences to be straight up deleted from the film. In order to make up for the lost time, they padded things out by extending the flashback portions of the film to reach a theatrical length. It's also said that Oliver Reed's alcoholism was really giving him a hard time and affecting his performance, and Fonda stated that the actor was a mere caricature of his former self. It did get a limited theatrical run, but didn't really make that big of a dent, although it was quite popular on the home market. And I'll give this one a 3. It's full of fun bits, but the beginning and end are where it's all at. Like the middle of this one is a bit of a drag, but there's enough cool moments for me to enjoy. The significance is a 2.5 though, since I think it did get some recognition and was very visible on store shelves, but that was never quite that popular, but it does have enough name value in it to boost it a bit. Should you watch it? Yeah, I think it's worth a go. Now we're going back to Hong Kong for the second time in this block for a movie that debuted there on October 29th, and it's The Boxer's Omen. It starts with a boxing match, or I guess a kickboxing match. It's a rough bout, but Wing wins, although Bo doesn't take it well and attacks, which paralyzes him. Right after, there's a mob hit, which tries to take out a guy named Hung, but he's saved by Buddha? Oh, and then there's a sex scene, which features a comically long shot of boobs pressed against glass, for those that are into that sort of thing. Hung continues to have those visions, and he's also Wing's brother, and he asks him to get revenge on Bo for him. And the dude is just still fighting, so I guess there was no consequences for paralyzing a fellow fighter after the match was over? Those are some lenient rules. Hung challenges him to a match and then locates a Buddhist temple, where it's told that their former leader King Zhao went up against a group of black magic users, turning them into bats. But then troubles abound when other magicians are reviving their skeletons to try to escape, which is just like amazing. But wait, because this gets even more awesome with skulls and brains and then little evil spiders slurping up venom in order to inject it directly into King's eyes. It turns out that in a previous life, King and Hung were twins, and now it's up to him to help rescue his soul and help him to achieve immortality before his body decomposes, or else Hung will also die. Think things are insane so far? Well, how about puking up an eel that then barks? Hung begins his training, becoming a monk, which does involve leeches, but then also, whatever this is, like our villain even becomes the tall man at one point. And just when you think that things have hit their peak, you're wrong, because there's alligator skulls on the attack. This alien head thing, self-decapitations. I mean, I'm telling you, every 5 minutes of this movie is giving you something insane and fun. And I should point out, this is only half done. Hung still has a boxing match and a brother to avenge. And this movie is by Chi Hung Kwai, and this man has directed a bunch of movies in China all through the 70s. One of his films was called Bewitched, which came out in '81, and I regret not covering it in the '81 episodes. But this film is sometimes called a loose sequel to that one, although there's really nothing to connect them except thematically. And I love this. It's a 4. It loses some of its mojo in the final act, but this movie's a trip from start to finish. It's just so insanely fun, and you think you have this idea of what they're going to throw at you next, but you're wrong. Its significance is just a 1.5 though, since it's not that well known, but it's starting to get more of a cult audience now and is drawing more attention. Should you watch it? Oh, hell yeah, this is a treasure. Our final film on the block is one that had a screening in Los Angeles on October 31st. Halloween, but never really had a theatrical run, and then went to video, and it's A Polish Vampire in Burbank. It begins with a vampire waking up wearing bat PJs, and oh boy, there's some very classy dialogue.
Hey, what you be doing, my woman?
and a vampire woman is on the attack. She's teamed up with another, older vamp who can only drink through straws, and he brings back blood for Dupa, his son who he thinks is lazy and won't seek out his own victims. Seems that he had an older brother that was an idiot that Yvonne here had to train, and he was Eddie Deason, really stretching his acting here and playing, yep, that one character Eddie Deason played. However, if you listen closely, you'll notice that he sounds a touch different, but we'll talk about that in a little bit.
Oh, I can't believe my parents would ever do that.
His brother's name was Sphincter, and he was so embarrassed of his failures that he disappeared. On the prowl, Dupa meets Dolores, who happens to love vampire movies, and by the way, Dupa is Polish for butt. He doesn't bite her and instead falls for her and is visited by the spirit of Sphincter, now a skeleton, who wants to give him advice and help him along. Dupa then continues to try to woo Dolores, but then there's a really bizarre bit with a man in a tuxedo in a hot tub, and I'll get back to that too. He also encounters a young guy who has his own problems because every month at the full moon he doesn't turn into a werewolf, he becomes a queer wolf, which I'm sure was just a hilarious top shelf joke in 1983. He then continues his relationship while trying not to tell her he's a vampire and also win the favor of his father. And there's a bunch to talk about here. This was a movie by indie filmmaker Mark Pirro. It was only his second feature film, with his first being a James Bond spoof called The Spy Who Did It Better. The guy in the hot tub was actually the main character from that film, making a minor cameo, which can be pretty confusing if you've not seen that one. This was made for an incredibly low budget, said to be around $2,500, which was achieved by shooting the film on Super 8, a very low-grade film stock that was cheap, and most of the cast and crew worked for free. Also, since Super 8 and Sync Sound don't mesh that well, all of the audio had to be done in post-production and be dubbed over. Originally, Deason was meant to play Dupa and agreed to do it for free as a favor, but then, after a couple of days of shooting, left. Pirro then had to do a little reworking of the script and turned what they had filmed with him into flashbacks, and then introduced his skeleton form to keep the character in the movie. But, since he wasn't around anymore for the post-production, Pirro had to do all of Deason's dialogue dubbing himself with an imitation of the actor's voice. But then, it was an unlikely success. The director sold the film for $40,000 to a distribution company, and went on to be a big hit on video, bringing in around $500,000 in rentals. It then spawned a sequel, or I guess more of a spin-off, with Curse of the Queer Wolf, based on the minor character here. And there's some charm here, but it's not great. I'll give it a 3. Like, there's a certain cheap vibe going on here and a fair amount of creativity to admire, even if some of the jokes fall flat, and others did not age well at all. Its HCS is a 2, since it did get a bunch of attention at the time and was heavily featured on video shelves and on cable shows, but never got that much recognition beyond it. Should you watch it? I mean, if you're into super low budget, silly vamp flicks, I mean, it's worth it.
That's a shoe like.
So there you have it, getting further into 1983 here. My favorite one of this block, it's gonna be The Boxer's Omen. That movie was so much fun. I had never seen that one before, and holy cow, did I enjoy watching that. It's a good time. Let me know which of these was your favorite down below in the comments. Let me know which of these you've seen, which of these you haven't seen, which of these you'd now like to see. Also, hit that thumbs up button if you enjoyed this video. Hit the subscribe button if you want to keep on following this channel, and go to my Patreon page, patreon.com/movietimelines, to help support this channel and to keep this project going. And we are now nearing the ending of 1983. There's only a couple of episodes left as we wind this down right here on the 80s Project.